I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
This is a WZDX News special presentation. Dr. Martin Luther King, Remembering the Dream.
Good afternoon and welcome to our special Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Remembering the Dream. I'm Jen Jacobson.
And I'm Mo Carter. It was 50 years ago this week that Dr. King was assassinated in the city of Memphis, Tennessee.
Over the next 30 minutes, we'll take a look at his legacy and what transpired that fateful day in Memphis.
55 years ago, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C.
But what you may not know is that he gave a very similar speech at Oakwood University in Huntsville.
Our very own Rebecca Petit sat down with a former Oakwood student who was fortunate enough to see and hear the civil rights icon in person.
Coming south was a magnificent experiment.
Dr. Tim McDonald moved to Huntsville from Pennsylvania in 1958 to attend what was then called Oakwood College.
I'd never been south before. I'd heard many stories about the South, many scary stories for African Americans, or colored people as we were called back then.
At that time, the civil rights movement was just gaining momentum.
Still in its infancy, you know, even though the sit-ins had happened, and we got worried that many of our brothers and sister students from Alabama A&M were sitting in to lunch counters and theaters and restaurants across the city. We weren't allowed to do it. And Oakwood in those days was very, as I said, conservative.
So you could imagine his surprise when the 22-year-old found out that the biggest leader of the civil rights movement would be speaking at his school.
It was major. I mean, the campus was just on fire that Dr. Martin Luther King was coming to Oakwood. You know, I mean, people didn't even know Oakwood. You know, we were rather a small, insignificant, church-supported college, but to have that kind of notoriety was big, and as a student, we were just pumped. It was fantastic.
Oakwood College was the only venue which would allow King to speak.
I would say there were upwards of close to 3,000 people there. They were everywhere, inside the gym, outside the gym, all around. Alabama A&M sent their band, and many of the church leaders in town were on the rostrum.
On March 19, 1962, a year before Dr. King gave his now famous I Have a Dream speech, he gave a similar speech at the Oakwood Auditorium.
Many of the themes that he presented at the mall in Washington, D.C. a year later.
Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee.
You can hear on that tape in 1962. So you might say that we were his proving ground for his major speech.
McDonald says attending that speech mobilized him and his classmates to push for change in Huntsville, which was still segregated.
After that speech, some of us actually defied the administration and went down and sat in. I remember sitting in at the Woolworth 5 and 10 cent store cafeteria. We weren't allowed to eat there as blacks, but we went there and we sat in on the lunch counter, and they wouldn't serve us.
But following King's visit, the tide began to turn.
Integration in Huntsville came very rapidly. Soon after, within a year, I would say, I think you could eat anywhere in Huntsville. You could go anywhere, you could stay anywhere, you could ride anywhere. I think the vestiges of segregation vanished very quickly in Huntsville. Much of it as a result of Dr. King's speech.
And on this 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., McDonald says his speech,
Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children,
is as relevant today as it was in 1963.
I think a lot of that has been accomplished, but we still have a long way to go before we have full equality and full acceptance by black and whites.
Memphis will forever be known as the place where Dr. King was killed on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel.
Dr. King was in town to assist 1,300 African-American sanitation workers who were on strike. Tensions were running high between the city's black community and the white mayor, who had ordered them to return to work.
Rudy Williams talked to one of those workers.
I was on one front line, then come back home and get on another front line.
Elmore Nickelberry returned to Memphis after the Vietnam War to the only job he could find, collecting garbage for the Memphis Sanitation Department. 64 years later, he still works there. He recalls the days leading up to the Memphis sanitation workers' strike of 1968.
There's a doubt in my mind. I thought one time they wouldn't know do it.
On February 11th, 1968, T.O. Jones, a former sanitation worker fired for trying to organize a union, called for the massive march from a downtown tire store to Memphis City Hall to address their concerns with Memphis Mayor Henry Loeb. Evidence of the unsafe working conditions. Just 2 weeks earlier, 2 Memphis sanitation workers were crushed to death in the back of a garbage truck which malfunctioned when they took shelter from a driving rainstorm.
But they were living in poverty, and many of the sanitation workers lived in neighborhoods without sewage systems.
The men were forced to work in bad weather, carrying garbage in tubs above their heads, the liquid waste leaking down onto them, and nowhere to clean themselves.
I couldn't ride the bus, because when I ride the bus, people tell me that I was nasty garbage man, so it made me feel bad, so I started walking home.
February 12th, day 1 of the strike, Memphis Mayor Loeb ordered the men back to work. T.O. Jones, along with attorneys representing the workers and union organizers, began negotiations with the city, but it was short-lived. February 14th, negotiations break down. Sanitation workers wanted the city to recognize their union. The mayor refused, so union leaders urged the Memphis City Council to step in. Sanitation workers began daily marches to Memphis City Hall. Then, on March 9th, word came that civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was coming to Memphis at the urging of several Memphis ministers.
That made everybody feel good. We said we were going to get something done. Martin Luther King coming down.
King had just kicked off what would be known as his Poor People's Campaign, a movement to improve economic conditions for all people regardless of color. March 18th, 17,000 people packed a Memphis church to listen as King called for a citywide march in just 4 days. But a snowstorm made it impossible for King to return for the march.
It snowed 14 inches.
With a canceled march, the city and union agreed to mediation.
All of white Memphis was saying, well, see, God didn't want those sanitation workers striking. And all of black Memphis was saying, see, God's on our side. Nobody got to go to work today.
On March 28th, a march led by King was interrupted by violence. Police with nightsticks and tear gas maced the men, women, and children who joined the sanitation workers. Police arrested nearly 300 people and shot and killed a 16-year-old marcher. King immediately retreated from the march. He left the city, but promised to return. Rudy Williams reporting.
The former secretary of the union who helped organize the Memphis sanitation workers later observed that the strike's impact reached beyond Memphis. It ultimately helped sanitation workers around the country gain respect.
Last year, the city of Memphis granted each of the surviving striking sanitation workers $50,000. Still ahead, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his final speech entitled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop" in Memphis, Tennessee.
Coming up next, we'll hear from 2 people who were there that night.
This WZDX News special presentation, Dr. Martin Luther King, Remembering the Dream, continues.
Welcome back. 50 years ago this week, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech in front of a packed house at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee.
It would be his final speech before being assassinated the very next day. While the speech dealt mainly with the Memphis sanitation strike, his speech also touched on other issues such as nonviolent protests and unity.
Katina Rankin spoke to a pair of locals who were in attendance that night, hanging on to Dr. King's every word.
Let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness.
It's been 50 years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous mountaintop speech at Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee.
He was our leader. He gave us strength. He gave us motivation. He was an example, and he preached brotherhood and peace.
And Tennessee State Representative Johnny Turner remembers that night like it was yesterday.
I have never before that time and since that time seen something like that. I mean, lightning, thundering, it was just indescribable. It's kind of like an omen.
But Turner was determined to hear the Baptist minister that stormy night on April 3rd, 1968.
It was just a feeling that you were in the presence of Dr. King and participating in a cause that was right and just. My husband and I had attended every speech that he gave, every one of them.
And when Turner and her husband pulled up to 930 Mason Street in downtown Memphis, she says it was unforgettable.
We got to Mason Temple. The place was packed. We had to sit up in the balcony.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life.
He mounted that pulpit. And boy, what a sermon he gave.
Up to now, only the garbage men have been feeling pain.
It was just something about his presence. It was something about his ability to articulate the thoughts that all of us had and didn't have the words to explain it. It was his motivation to those of us that each of us had a role to play in helping those sanitation workers get living wages.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights.
Gloston Anderson, a worker at the Memphis Kellogg's plant, was there at Mason Temple too.
Maybe 300 or 400, all you could get in. It was just packed.
Anderson says King's words electrified the room.
They just shouted, and they grabbed him and hugged him. That's when they walked off stage.
When he got through, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. It was no one sitting. We gave him an ovation that was unreal. We were fixated. When Dr. King preached, you hung on to every word. It was like magnetism. We just know that he preached his heart out.
And 5 decades later, Turner remembers. She remembers his sermon about brotherhood and of peace. But she says his dream has not yet been achieved 50 years later.
Dr. King's dream is still to be realized. He's been deceased for 50 years. It's about time to wake up from this nightmare and make his dream a reality.
But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Katina Rankin reporting.
There were threats on his life before. He narrowly escaped an assassination attempt in 1958 in Harlem, New York.
He was signing copies of his book, Stride Towards Freedom, when a woman plunged a 7-inch letter opener into his chest.
And his mother was killed by a gunman while playing the organ in church.
Coming up, we'll talk to iconic civil rights Congressman John Lewis about his time with Dr. King.
But first, we'll take a look at Dr. King's final day in Memphis and why some say he almost did not make the trip that fateful day. Stay with us.
This WZDX News special presentation, Dr. Martin Luther King, Remembering the Dream, continues.
Dr. King's many supporters in the 60s feared his message that nonviolence might someday result in his death.
On April the 4th, 1968, at the age of 39, those worst fears came true. Richard Ramson takes us through that terrible day in the city of Memphis, Tennessee.
Dr. Martin Luther King almost didn't come to Memphis that fateful day.
There was a lot of dissension and debate about where the movement should go in those last days.
Memphis historian and author Hampton Sides says King's inner circle were at odds with King about where the movement was headed and concerned about King's safety. Friend and pastor James Netters, who was also a Memphis city councilman, encouraged King to return to Memphis for what would be a peaceful march in support of striking sanitation workers.
I was so fond of him. He was my mentor. He was my idol.
They both knew the entire movement of nonviolence was on the line. King left Atlanta April 3rd. But even before his plane could get off the ground, an anonymous bomb threat delayed the flight for an hour. When the jet finally took off, King is said to have joked, "It looks like they won't kill me on this flight." The next day, April 4th, King was upbeat. So was Reverend Netters. With a federal injunction delaying the march, Netters hoped the march might not even be necessary. In fact, less than an hour before the assassination, Netters had just secured the 9 city council votes needed to settle the sanitation strike and override a mayoral veto. But history would have something else in mind. Dr. King was in room 306 getting ready for dinner. Meantime, across the street, a firehouse, station number 2. Some undercover Memphis TACT officers are watching from a window, looking down below, not expecting any trouble. And then from the boarding house, overlooking it all, James Earl Ray, who was about to be presented with an opportunity that he thought he was going to have to wait days for. King's location and even his room number had been reported in the local media. But even so, Ray must have been surprised to see Dr. King on the second balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Accounts say Ray quickly got his rifle and belongings, took a few short steps from his room to the communal bathroom, and cracked open the window. Memphis Minister Reverend Billy Kiles was on the balcony with King.
Hey guys, come on, let's go. By that time, the shot rang out. Kapow! The bullet knocked him to the ground. I turned and saw him fall.
The images would be broadcast around the world. Reverend Edders was just blocks away.
Bedlam. I broke up. They killed my man, and they took a whole lot to calm me down.
Dr. King was pronounced dead an hour later. Remarkably, James Earl Ray slipped out of Memphis, and the largest manhunt in U.S. history was underway. It would take 60 days to find him. Ray was about to board a plane bound for Belgium and then Rhodesia, and he almost got away with it. Few think he acted alone.
Money is the big question. Where did he have the money to do all this stuff?
Nobody could do that much of a crime and then disappear that quickly and get completely out of the country. He had a lot of help.
50 years later, the magic of King's message and mystery surrounding his death live on. I'm Richard Ransom reporting.
Now here's something interesting. James Earl Ray confessed to killing Dr. King almost a year later, but then spent the rest of his life insisting he was not the only one involved.
A congressional committee in 1978 concluded that it was likely Ray did not act alone. No one else was ever arrested in connection with the murder. Ray died in prison in 1998. Just ahead, you'll hear from a living icon in the civil rights movement, Congressman John Lewis.
And what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King might say about President Trump and the anti-gun violence movement if he were alive today. Stay with us.
This WZDX News special presentation, Dr. Martin Luther King, Remembering the Dream, continues.
Welcome back to our special on Dr. Martin Luther King. Congressional man John Lewis wasn't always a politician. See, the Alabama native began his professional career working closely with Dr. King, fighting for civil rights, especially during the Selma to Montgomery campaign.
Our Washington correspondent Bree Jackson sat down with Congressman Lewis as he reflected on Dr. King's life, the legacy he left behind, and how Dr. King's work is continuing 50 years after his death.
Walking into Congressman John Lewis's office is like walking into American history. Photographs give a glimpse into key moments, including the day Lewis, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and other civil rights leaders planned the historic March on Washington.
And when the march was all over, President Kennedy invited us back down to the White House. He stood in the Oval Office greeting each one of us, saying, "You did a good job, you did a good job." And when he got to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he said, "You did a good job and you had a dream."
Lewis says as a teen he was inspired by Dr. King's message and left small-town Alabama to join the fight against segregation. Lewis recalls the first time the two civil rights icons met.
And Dr. King said, "Are you John Lewis? Are you the boy from Troy?" And I said, "Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis." I gave my whole name. But he still called me the boy from Troy.
The two formed a close bond as they led demonstrations and worked to improve economic opportunities for Black Americans. Lewis remembers campaigning in Indianapolis when he heard news from Memphis that Dr. King had been shot.
I think and believe that when Dr. King died, something died in America and something died in all of us.
What do you think that was?
A sense of hope, a sense of optimism.
And since Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, African Americans have been able to rise to leading roles in business, in the media, in government, and even to the White House itself. But Lewis says had Dr. King survived, race relations would be better.
Do your job! Do your job!
Lewis believes Dr. King would have concerns about current issues dividing our country.
He would tell Mr. Trump that we can't go back, we're going forward. And he would say to him in so many words, if you fail to take care of the people, all of the people, I will organize, I will mobilize a movement.
We want change! We want change! The congressman sees some reminders of Dr. King in the recent student-led marches against gun violence.
We're so proud to see hundreds and thousands of high school students in the streets, understanding the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence.
While Lewis has seen activism like this before, he says he may never see another leader like Martin Luther King Jr. again.
I'm not so sure that we will be blessed or be so lucky to witness the likeness of Martin Luther King Jr. ever again. He was one of a kind.
50 years after his assassination, memories shared, photographs on the wall, and this man helped keep Dr. King's legacy alive. In Washington, Bree Jackson.
Now, as Bree mentioned, Congressman John Lewis was in Indianapolis the day Dr. King was assassinated.
In honor of this year's anniversary of Dr. King's death, Lewis returned to the exact location in Indiana for the first time in 50 years. We hope you did learn a lot today. Did you learn a lot today?
I definitely learned a lot today, and it reminds me one person really can make all the difference in the world and truly change the world. So a legacy, and I'm so happy that we are continuing to remember his legacy to this day.
Absolutely. Hopefully we can continue to do so over the next 50 years through many generations following that.
And we want to thank you so much for your time spending with us today.
To learn more on the special report or any of our stories we've shown you here on WZDX, head over to our website, rocketcitynow.com. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great weekend.